Hey everybody, ready to go live here. I want to be talking about breathing. We've had a theme all week on principles of program design, talking about practical applications for breathing and how we can use that to improve our health and performance. And so we're going to go through a whole spectrum of things. We're going to give a couple minutes for everybody to sign on and get engaged here. So welcome for the people that are here. Thank you for coming out. What we're going to be doing is each week we have a different theme for this project that I'm working on. It's called Principles of Program Design. Mike Perry and myself, usually every Friday we'll have Mike with us, but Mike is getting some much needed family time right now. He's had quite a long year if you followed Mike's story, but I'm going to be taking it solo this week, just talking about breathing. If you have any questions, be sure to put them in the comments and shoot them out to us. Or if you ever have any ideas that you want to talk about in terms of things that we're going to do on these lives, we do them every Friday at 1 o'clock. Next week, I believe we are talking about training high school teams, and it's something that I've been doing for quite some time, and there's a lot of debate back and forth on the best way to do that, and there's also a lot of ways and it's not being done well, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let's jump in and let's get going with breathing. And let's just talk about some basics, and because we have people of all different ends of the continuum in terms of their training with breathing, some of this may be Dr. Seuss simple, but let's kind of go through the mechanics of what happens when we bring air into our bodies, and then how that impacts how we move, how we feel, and what that actually impacts. So, simple analogy, okay, using a balloon. So our lungs sit right here, okay, and when we take air in, they're going to expand. They can almost double in size. Now, how does that happen? You have something called the diaphragm that cuts you in half, basically from top to bottom. And when that contracts, it pushes down. It's this dome-like thing that pushes down. And to make space, your visceral, your stuff in your guts, make room and push out. Now, that's the one primary way we can do it. The other way we can do it is you can also expand up a little bit. And we'll talk about the difference between the two, and when we might want to use one versus the other, and then also what this means. Because I have all this air in here, that creates some pressure, and we can actually use that to our advantage. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. So some of the things that this can impact. One of the biggest things that it can impact, and one of the biggest things we impact with our training and really our everyday habits, is our autonomic nervous system. That's that system that regulates everything in our body, and we have the two primary sides of that. We have the fight or flight, that's the sympathetic side of things, and then you have the rest and digest, which is the parasympathetic side of things. So it's going to have an impact on that autonomic nervous system, and because of that, it's going to impact everything from our heart rate to our heart rate variability, our mental state, our emotions, our blood pH, your posture, and it's kind of a two-way street. We'll talk about that in a second. And then even your ability to motor learn. And so when we talk about teaching people movement, one of the first things I talk about with breathing is to say, once you stop breathing, you stop learning. Because once you stop breathing, you're now in that sympathetic fight or flight type of response. And when that happens, we're not going to really absorb any type of new motor learning happening. So make sure that if the very least, if you're teaching movement, you're learning movement, or really trying to acquire any skill, make sure that we are not holding your breath, because it's not going to be conducive to that. But there are times we may want to hold your breath. We'll talk about that as we go too. So it's a little bit of chicken and the egg, in that your autonomic nervous system gets its name because it was always considered to be automatic. And so you could go through your whole day and not even really think about your breathing, yet you'll still breathe. But then you can actually hack your way into that autonomic nervous system, because it's something we can consciously do. And we can create stimulation of either side of that depending on the situation and what we want to create. And so your breathing can lower your heart rate, can lower your blood pressure, or the opposite. And so it is kind of a way that we can, the one window we can get into that autonomic nervous system and create some change within there depending on the situation. Speaking of chicken and the egg, I mentioned posture before. Now, because of the way the air comes in, and we'll talk about the difference between nose breathing and mouth breathing, but it comes down through the airway and gets into the lungs. So obviously the positioning of everything on top, in and around that, is going to affect your ability to breathe. And so if you have poor posture, that forward head carriage, rounded upper back, internally rotated shoulders that most people have from sitting at a laptop or on their phones all day. Well, that's going to cut down your airway and it's going to influence your ability to get air in. Now, this oxygen that we're taking in and processing is the fuel for every single mechanism, cellular mechanism in your body, so including your brain function. So this is where that poor posture limits that airflow. It's going to impact your performance physically, impact your performance mentally. But let's talk about the other side of that. Let's say that I breathe poorly, and we talked earlier about the difference between having more of that belly type breathing, that diaphragmatic breathing where we're getting deeper breaths, where we're getting good expansion and that diaphragm's pushing down. Well, in stressful situations, we also have the ability where your scalenes and some of these neck muscles also attach to the aponeurosis, your lungs, and will pull up, right? So if you think of someone who's really heaving and out of breath, or someone who's in a stressful situation, they're going to pull up here. And so because of that, that will actually in turn affect your structure and posture. So a little thing you can do if you're just watching along at home, if you just find your collarbones, find your clavicles here, and just put your fingertips in and around there. Now, if you take a good, deep diaphragmatic breath down into your belly, you probably don't feel a whole lot going on. But then think of that really super stressful breath, right? And you breathe up and you get that apical type breathing, they call it. Now you feel all those muscles kind of take a stranglehold on your fingertips. And what that happens is when we're contracting those muscles, they're going to now, if you do that over time, no different than if I did a couple thousand bicep curls a day, they're going to adaptively shorten. And when we're taking anywhere between 15 and 25,000 breaths a day, imagine doing that to your scalenes, and now they start to stiffen and shorten, and maybe pull your head forward a little bit more. And we just talked about that before, how that's going to now feed into that cascade of limiting your oxygen intake. And so it becomes this vicious cycle we have to get out of. And you'll have people that'll come in with neck and or shoulder problems that you can do all the stretching and heating and poking and prodding and rubbing and exercise in the world for those tissues, that if they're going to breathe poorly 20,000 times a day and overactivate all these tissues, it's going to be a hard thing to undo if we don't address the breathing first. Okay, so that's just kind of the chicken and the egg with structure. Now, the next thing, and I explain this when I start with athletes and teams, and first we start with just the overall impact of breathing, and that you can go for, weeks or days without food, weeks without food, days without water. You can go only a couple minutes without air. And so because of that, it's extremely important. It's one of the ways we tell if someone's alive or dead. And so because of that, we want to make sure that we're looking into this right, and then the impact that will have on your every system in your body, especially through that ANS, that autonomic nervous system. Now, if you think about it this way, why this was even created is because if we were thousands of years ago and we got into a stressful situation, and I always use the example of we're in our cave and a tiger walks in that cave, right? You got to figure out pretty quickly if you're going to have dinner or if you're going to be dinner. And so because of that, we want to elevate our heart rate, we want to elevate our blood pressure, we want to get ready to fight or flight or even freeze to in that natural situation. The problem is now we kind of don't have that on-off type switch. Is we die at kind of what we call I think Tim Ferriss came up with the term a simmering 7. So instead of being at 1, 2, or 3 in a relaxed state, or 9 or 10 in this hyperactive fight or flight state, we kind of just simmer right at the top edge of that sympathetic nervous system. And so because of that causes all sorts of poor health effects. But now let's go back to breathing. If that tiger walks in your cave, how are you going to breathe? Are you going to breathe down into your belly like, oh, that's a nice tiger? Or are you going to breathe like, holy shit, there's a tiger in my cave? All right, and the same thing goes for whether you're going to breathe through your nose or your mouth. You're generally in a stressful situation, going to breathe through your mouth. Now, we don't want to do that all throughout the day. Now, are there cases where we might want to do that? Yes, possibly. All right, and if anybody just ran a 100-meter sprint, will tell you that's a necessary evil for you to be able to do. But we want to try to look at now different situational breathing, okay? And we'll talk about a bunch of different situations, but ideally throughout the vast majority of your day, we want to always encourage nasal breathing. All right, and that's in terms of health. And I promise I give you a bunch of resources. I'm going to be posting a list of resources of some of the people that have impacted me in my studying of breathing, because it's probably the most impactful thing in the last 10 years of my professional life and personal health and wellness that I've kind of learned about. And one of the books that's an easy start for people to learn breathing, it's one of those books that I recommend to people that had people have turned around and said it absolutely changed their life, and that is the book Breath. By James Nestor. And James is a science writer, he's a nature writer, and one of the things he went to go study was these free divers, and was amazed by how they could hold their breath and how they could impact their performance just by controlling their breath, by being able to go underwater for minutes at a time. And so because of that, he started studying the science of breathing. He went to a researcher out in Stanford and started learning about the impact of nasal breathing, and said, well, what type of research do we have on nasal versus mouth breathing? And the doctor said, well, I can't really ethically do a lot of that with humans because I know the impact of mouth breathing, and I don't feel comfortable having subjects do that. So he volunteered himself, and James Nestor found someone else to do it with him, and they actually packed his nasal passages so where he couldn't breathe anywhere else except through his mouth. And before doing this, they did fitness testing, they did cardiovascular testing, they did all sorts of health measures. And within a very short period of time, within less than 2 weeks, he started having all these health things go right into the tank. Started to snore, started to have elevated blood pressure, loss of energy, his fitness levels went down, all these things crashed. And then as soon as he unpacked his nasal passages, everything started to rebound and come back within another week or two. And so it started to really enlighten into the impact of nasal breathing. Another resource that I will give you is, if you're not listening to Dr. Andrew Huberman's podcast, he's a great researcher out of Stanford as well, who has a great podcast. And he just did a recent episode talking about breathing that you can research. That'll be on the list. But he also talks about the effect of brain function with nasal breathing. Then we go into performance. One of the biggest things that I found with my teams when we talk about conditioning and working with high school teams is when I started implementing nasal breathing into their conditioning at the end of practice. And the boost that we have seen in our conditioning has been significant. And one of the ways I can tell that, ironically, is looking at how they breathe. And so I joke about this, that I'll be in the sidelines at one of our football team's games, and I remember one night in particular, one of our assistant coaches, we were down a little bit, and he says, "Oh, we got to get in better shape." And I said, "Well, I'm not sure about that." And I don't think we're losing because of that. We're losing because we can't cover people or tackle people. That's really what the bigger issue was. But then I said, let's watch. Fourth quarter, 2 minutes left. We call a timeout. Players come over. Every single player had their mouthpiece in, had their helmet on and mouthpiece in. Now, if you've ever been on the sideline of a football game, as soon as there's a timeout, you'll see kids ripping their helmets off. You'll see kids dying for air. Our kids had their mouthpieces in, never took them out. And that tells me that we were in not only really good fitness, but we had started to make a shift in how they breathe. Now, it doesn't mean that they're always going to breathe like that, especially, they're running for a touchdown or trying to track somebody down. But that's one of the big ways we look at fitness. And we'll do sprint intervals where they'll walk for a period of time. Usually we'll have about a 20, 30-second walk, depending on where they are and how early we are in the stages of conditioning. And we'll just do a 10-second all-out sprint. But they have to keep the mouth sealed and only breathe through their nose. And it's been an incredibly impactful thing. If you're doing your cardiovascular conditioning, always breathing through the nose, it is going to make a big difference in your aerobic health and fitness. So let's talk about, how do we know if I have good breathing? Because people say, well, how do I know if I breathe well? There's a bunch of different gauges. The one that we can go to first is, there's actually another resource that I'm going to give on the list, is there is a breathing course that Functional Movement Systems did with Dr. Kyle Kiesel and Dr. Rosalba Courtney. And they go through all the science of breathing and also talk about something we use called the functional residual capacity, which is a breath hold test that we look at to kind of tell where someone is at and how well they're managing their autonomic nervous system on a breath hold. It's very similar to another resource I will give you is Patrick McCune. And if you check him out at Oxygen Advantage, he has a book called The Oxygen Advantage, and he has something called a Bolt Score, which is a breath hold time. And then even Dr. Andy Galpin, who's a great researcher. If you're not researching him, check him out. He's out at UCLA. He does a timed exhale. So if you were just sitting in a relaxed position, you'd start to exhale. And we time how far and extended that exhale is. And then other things we look at in terms of your breathing health is your breathing frequency. There are some things like I wear an Oura Ring, the Whoop Band, things like that. I'm not too familiar with the Apple Watch, but a lot of things will actually track your breathing frequency, especially when you're sleeping. And so the more frequent you breathe, the more poor breathing habits you have. We want to take as less frequent breaths as possible. And there's some good research that shows the less you breathe, the better. And then with that, there was actually some cool stuff that Whoop did with their data where they found there was a correlation with a change in your breaths per minute, your breathing rate when you're sleeping, and COVID. And what they found is the breathing rates pretty much stay consistent if you're tracking that. But when they saw a big jump, and I actually had COVID just around Christmas time, not this past year, the year before, and I was wearing a Whoop Band at the time, and I saw a huge jump. I'm usually around 13 breaths per minute when I'm sleeping. It jumped to like 18 for that week that I had COVID. It's pretty wild, and that was before I had tested positive. So there's huge correlations with health and your breathing frequency. So now, let's talk about situational breathing, because you don't breathe the same for everything. Because when someone says, all right, great, well, teach me how to breathe then. Well, the first question I'm going to have is, what is your situation? Because there are times where I may want to calm you down, and that's where we're going to do more of that diaphragmatic deep type breathing. And it's also going to be situations where I want to ramp you up. Okay, so I posted a thing on my story, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before, some baseball guys I had, and we were going to go out and do some power work. And it was towards the end of their training week. They're a little bit fatigued. So one of the things we did is we started after their warm-ups, we did some Wim Hof breathing. Okay, and if you're not familiar with Wim Hof, he's quite a character. I've gotten a chance to meet him and do one of his live events. And I actually practice his breathing on a daily basis for the last few years. And Wim Hof practices something that is derivative of something called Tumo breathing. And Tumo breathing is something that yogis did for thousands of years. It actually changes heat in the body. It's pretty wild to learn about. And you see these stories of yogis who would actually perform deep breathing and create enough heat where they can, sit in snow and melt the snow around them. It's wild what they can do. But his Tumo breathing, or the Wim Hof type breathing, exaggerates the inhale. The inhale creates an excitation. Our heart rate goes up with the inhale, and it goes down with the exhale. So if we want to create excitation, where we want to ramp up the nervous system, you're a little bit tired, you're dragging, you're not focused, we might want to exaggerate your inhale. So a Wim Hof breath would be more a big full breath in, and just let the air kind of fall out. So it's... And if you notice, everything's moving. It's not just my belly. And he tells you to cycle your breath where you're going to breathe it down and kind of loop it around. So you get this big wave, and you would do repeats of 20 to 30 to 40 of those breaths, and follow that up with a breath hold. And there's actually some pretty good research on this practicing this hyperventilation that can show benefits for both mental and physical health. And that's one type of breathing, but that's obviously not something I want to do if I already am redlined and I'm in that sympathetic state. And I always tell, because I work with a lot of baseball players, we all hear, mom or dad or coach or somebody yell from the stands, when they're on the mound in a pressure situation or up at the plate in a pressure situation, and they'll say, Johnny, breathe. Well, what does that mean? Well, what if Johnny goes... That's the worst possible thing you do, right? It might be a good thing if they learn, Lamaze method and they're going to have a baby, but not a good thing if I'm trying to settle my nervous system and kind of get into that flow state. So on the other end of the spectrum, the breathing that we can most benefit from on a gross majority of the day is more of that relax, that what I call reset or recovery breathing. Now, we can use this in a couple different situations. We can use this, one of the first ways I get people to use it is because we have such an issue with sleep in our society, and sleep is an incredibly impactful thing. We may end up doing a live just on sleep. Is just before you go to bed, 20 deep diaphragmatic breaths. Okay, so now what does that mean? How do we affect that? So if you put your left hand on your chest and your right hand on your belly button, and we take a deep breath in, remember we want that to go in through your nose. You should feel a nice expansion where you feel your right hand push out, your belly move, but nothing really happening here in your chest. And then when you breathe out, we want that exhale, because remember the exhale is relaxation, we want that to be twice as long as your inhale. So if it's, and we go in for 4, so we exhale for 8. Now it doesn't have to be 4 and 8, it can be 3 and 6 if you're just starting out, or it could even be longer, or we can actually add a hold to the middle of that. And this is something the Navy SEALs actually kind of got well known for, is called box breathing, where they do 4, 4, and 8. So it would be an inhale for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 8. Okay, but either way, exaggerate the exhale, make it about twice as long as the inhale. Make sure it goes down into your belly. Make sure that it doesn't come up and through your chest. Make sure that it goes in through your nose. And when you breathe out, either back out through your nose or out through kind of pursed lips, that it's more focused and concentrated, kind of like you're blowing out one candle, not blowing out a whole birthday cake. And it should be enough that if you were right next to somebody, they'd hear the audible breath, but they don't need to hear it across the room. And there's a bunch of different positions you can use for that. My post yesterday showed you some of these positions, from laying on your belly to laying on your back to hands and knees to even doing it seated. And then eventually you can learn to just do that in a standing situation. And my baseball players know that as they're digging into the batter's box or they're at the mound, they will actually do a breath as part of their routine each time they throw a pitch or get up, or if they're in the field right before play. And so that kind of goes with any sports. Taking that breath is kind of a natural reset. And you can lower your blood pressure. You can lower your heart rate, several beats, if not a significant amount, in just a short period of breaths. Now, if we're looking at this from an exercise standpoint, all right, we'll talk about some situations. When I give you a program, I'm going to give you, hey, here's the exercise you're going to do, and here's how many reps you're going to do, and here's how many sets you're going to do, and your weight and your tempo of how fast you're going to move. But I think it's just as important, if not more important than some of those things, is to tell you the breathing application you're going to do. So with this, how are you going to apply your breathing to this? What's our breathing tempo? When are we breathing out? When are we breathing in? Generally, we're going to breathe out on the effort, right? And breathe in on the recovery, and then possibly even hold, and we'll get to that in the strength part of this when we go into where we need some more stabilization. So it's not as simple as, walk into any place and look for the personal trainers, and when anything gets hard, they go, breathe, 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 without really a whole lot of explanation with that. So I go into detail of how each exercise should be performed in correlation with their breathing. Okay, now, we kind of talked about the reset recovery. We can use that not only as, something right before bed, we can use it anytime we're in a stressful situation. You're going to take a test. You're about to go in and give a big speech or presentation. You're just stressed out in general. You can just stop and do some of these breaths. There's actually a book that I'm going through now that talks about your resonance and how it can affect your emotions. Dr. Leah Lagos, she's also going to be on my list of resources that you can check out, that talks about a whole program she does just for that, to control your HRV through your breathing. And it also works during a workout. So in between sets, as opposed to kind of BSing at the water cooler, one of the things you can do is you can sit and recover. That's why one of the breathing positions I have is the bench breathing. You can be kind of inconspicuous in your gym, and in between sets of heavy squats or deadlifts or whatever you're doing, or even between sets of conditioning, you can get your recovery to come along much quicker. When I would do group conditioning stuff, one of the things we would do is just drop down in between as a recovery period. We go hands and knees and do breathing, or any one of those positions that I posted yesterday. Okay, now let's talk about how we talked about the balloon and the pressure in that balloon. You can use that to your advantage if we're doing a strength exercise. Okay, so what happens is when this balloon fills up, again, we have pressure. Okay, it's pressure here. Now, if this is the top, we have to now seal that off, because if I let go, all the pressure is going to go. So how do we seal it off? We want mouth closed, tongue on the roof of the mouth, right behind your front teeth. That seals off the top. Now from the bottom, what we do is then we create bracing through our trunk, all right? So we're not letting the belly expand and be loose. Now we create that bracing. And now what we have is this, what Pavel Tsatsouline says is the shield. And we can breathe behind the shield. Now we can do this in a continuous fashion where I'm bracing right now and I'm talking to you, but eventually I'm going to run out of air. Or I can create even more pressure. So power lifters will take a big breath in. And then at that point, because it's only a short period, you can breathe in through your nose or mouth, and some will even coach a double breath in, where you'll take a breath in, and then another. Now I have even more pressure in there. Now I don't want to let go of this pressure. So let's say I'm ready to do a heavy squat, right? And I'm going to take all this air in, I'm going to brace, I'm going to lower myself, and I'm going to hold that breath, okay? Now, obviously, if you're someone that has high blood pressure or this somewhere where holding your breath would be contraindicated from a medical condition, this is not something we'd advise. But you're going to hold that breath on the eccentric, because now that's creating this pressure. It's called a hydraulic lift mechanism, where it's creating stabilization within my trunk. I'm going to hold that on the way down. Now on the way up, I don't want to let all that pressure go, so I'm going to leak a little out. So that's why you're going to lower down, and on the way up, you're just going to let it out in just a little bit of a hissing fashion. And that's how we do it for strength, okay? Now, what about power? Power is a little different, because power has a time component. Squat, it doesn't matter how fast I get up. I'm going to try to move fast, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to move fast. Where power, it's got to go fast. So I need this air to get out fast, quickly. So that's where what we'll do is we'll coach to spit the air out. And so the post from today, we talk a little bit about how you match the speed of your breath to your speed that you're desiring in your movement. So if I'm going to do a medicine ball throw, I'm going to spit the air out. And this you can see and hear every day in athletics. You see the shot putter who yells, or the pitcher or tennis serve where you hear the grunt, or you hear the martial artist who does the ha, or you hear the boxer who when they punch. All of that is creating an instantaneous pressurization of your trunk that you can use as a foundation to launch your extremities off of. So you would load that air in, get loaded, then whenever you want to have the peak of whatever force you want to produce, whether it's a jump, whether it's a throw, whether it's something you're striking. Now, from there, we have, there's other situations where we're going to post tomorrow something I talk about where we have pacing with your breathing, because we've talked about strength where we're doing relatively heavy loads, or we're talking about power where we're doing short expressions of effort. But what about if I'm doing a longer type of thing? I'm going out for a run, or I'm going to do some cycling. Well, there we want to create some kind of rhythm, and you want to have some rhythm to your breath that you don't hyperventilate, and we can keep you at a steady pace from a mental aspect, from a physiological aspect. And so we're going to talk about some pacing breathing that we do. And I stole this from someone who kind of uses a 2-3 method. And what that means, if I was striding when I was running, I'd breathe in for 2, breathe out for 3. Now, that's something I can coach, but when I work with a runner, one of the easy ways to introduce it, I'll show you how we do this dead bug variation it's a core exercise. We're going to be posting this tomorrow, where we use the same thing with a heel tapping type of thing, where it helps set your rhythm in a really controlled environment, and then you can then take that and apply that to your run, to your ride, to whatever it is you're going to do for a more endurance aspect of it. Like I said, we're always going to try to layer nasal breathing on top of that, and the more we can keep it in and out through the nose, the better. And any athlete knows, if you have the person running next to you in a race, or the person across from you in a game, and they're breathing through their mouth, they're in that stress state, they're pretty much cooked. Okay? And then there are certain cases where we actually want to do breath holds, okay? Not just for the strength aspect of it, but breath holds to kind of challenge our ability to create better tolerance to CO2. So we breathe air in, and we think that when we hold our breath, or what we're challenged against is that need for more oxygen. It's actually not. It's once it gets in, it gets converted to CO2, and we want to blow that off, okay? And so because of that, when you get fatigued, when you get winded, when you feel that burning sensation, a lot of that is your ability to tolerate this buildup of CO2. And so because of that, we want to blow that off. But if you can challenge yourself with some breath holds, and there's some interesting things you can do with that. As I mentioned, the Wim Hof method uses a breath hold time after doing some specific ventilation, or hyperventilation, I can say. You can do it within your training. Patrick McKeon has introduced that into just simply going for a walk, and then during those walks you would do a specific breath hold during that. And it's something I've actually been experimenting with. One of the things that I like to do for cardio, just because I have it at the house and it's easy, is I have a stationary bike. And one of the programs I'll do, if I'm on a little bit lower recovery day, let's say my Oura Ring or my Morpheus strap shows I'm a little bit at a lower recovery day, or I'm just a little bit sore from squatting or deadlifting, and I want to still get a decent cardio workout, but I don't want to have that physiological cost or structural cost of really pushing myself and doing harder sprints or harder resistance. One of the things I can manipulate my heart rate and you almost get like a sprint interval type of effect is through breath holds. And this is something I've been just playing around with, but what I'll do is I'll work myself up right into kind of the top of that zone 2, or if you're using a Morpheus strap, right into the top end of my blue, bottom end of my green for my conditioning zone. If you use like the MAF technique of 180 minus your age for that target, I kind of go to the top end of that. And what I'll do is I'll do a breath hold every minute on the minute. So I'll do it for 30 minutes, and at the end of each minute, I'm nasal breathing the whole time. End of each minute, I'll breathe out and hold. Now, working at that level, I can usually get about a 10-second hold if I work at it, and get 12 to 15-second hold, and then resume my breathing, and then the next minute do it again. And what you'll see is pretty cool if you watch your heart rate. If I'm doing it well, I'll actually get 20. I think my best has been about a 20 to 25 beats per minute swing in my heart rate. So I can swing my heart rate from, say, 120 up to 140, 145 just by doing these breath holds. Now, if you think about the effects that can then have, is let's say I wanted to do these intervals, but I don't have the physical capacity because of muscle soreness, because of fatigue and so forth, or I don't have the recoverability, my HRV and all those things aren't where they should be. I can still get this type of effect by just doing something with my breath. And that is a pretty cool thing, because now I'm going to get some great conditioning to that. It also is going to help build up my CO2 tolerance, because I've noticed that my holds are getting better and longer. And so that's a neat thing you can kind of plug into your conditioning every once in a while. And then if you look at the work of people like Erwin LaCour, who really is kind of taking a deep dive into breath holds, he has a completely different approach to it. So a lot of different things you can do within your breath. And so if you missed any of the posts that I did this week, we kind of went through everything from the overview on breathing to and the impacts it has, to how do I breathe for strength, how do I breathe for reset and recovery, and then talking about the different positions you can do that in. Today we posted breathing for power, and then what I talked about with that breathing for rhythm and tempo, we're going to post that tomorrow. And then if you missed any part of this, make sure this will be posted later today. You can go back and watch it if you joined us late. And then last but not least, I will also be posting all the resources of the great people that I've been able to learn some interesting breathing stuff in, because I am not even scratching the surface. I am by far the furthest thing from a breathing expert. I'm just sharing the impact that it's had on me and the impact it's been able to have on my clients and athletes and being able to work with them. So going to pretty much wrap up today's talk. All right. Looking forward, a couple things to look forward to is each week, 1 o'clock, Mike Perry will be back with me next week. I'm not sure if we'll be on my feed or if we'll be on his. And then we're going to bounce back and forth every once in a while. We'll jump over to Facebook. But next week, we're going to be talking about training high school teams. And even if you don't work with high school teams, if you're an athlete or you work with athletes, this is going to be some important stuff to go through. And then in the weeks after that, we're going to be talking about using tech, things like Oura Rings and Whoop Bands and Apple Watches, and how you can utilize those and leverage those in your training, and how they may actually derail your training in some cases. Other things we're going to be talking about is habits. We're going to do a whole week. I think the week after the high school stuff, we're doing a whole week just on mobility work and what that is and the best approaches to that and different suggestions and things we've had success with. So all that's coming. Make sure you stay tuned. Give it a follow. Please share it with your friends. For our trainers and coaches and therapists out there, we're just getting ready to launch our Principles of Program Design course. We'll have the online course out in March. I'm heading up to Boston to film it in a couple weeks with Mike. We'll have that out in March, and we have our first live course is going to be just outside of Philly on May 1st, and we'll be getting out the information on that so you can register for that sometime soon. But for those of people who joined us, thank you for being here. Be sure to ask questions, send me a message, send us a message either here or at Principles of Program Design. Give us a follow, and make sure you breathe well. All right, or as my friend Wim Hof likes to say, breathe, mother effer. Thanks for joining.